I never thought my family would be torn apart by someone I once considered a brother. My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, was always seen as a respectable man, a good husband, a great father, someone I trusted completely. But everything I believed about him was a lie, because one day he told my wife he was in love with her, and that was only the beginning of the nightmare. It all started with a text message. That evening, my wife and I were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, when her phone buzzed. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and frowned. "What is it?" I asked. "It's your brother-in-law." I raised an eyebrow. "What does he want?" "He's asking if I'm free for lunch tomorrow," she said, confused. "He says he has something important to talk about." I paused. That was weird. We were a close family, but my brother-in-law had never invited my wife to a one-on-one lunch before. If he needed to talk about something important, why not include me? Did he say what it's about? No, just that it's personal. She hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe it's about my sister, maybe they're having issues, and he wants advice. That made sense. My wife and my sister had been best friends before I even married her. If my brother-in-law was struggling with their marriage, maybe he thought my wife could help. I nodded. All right, go and see what he wants. But if anything feels off, let me know. My wife agreed, not thinking much of it. At the time, I had no idea that I had just sent her straight into a nightmare. The next day, my wife met my brother-in-law at a cafe near her office. She got there early, picked a table by the window, and waited. 10 minutes later, he walked in. And the moment she saw him, she knew something was wrong. He looked nervous, more than she had ever seen him before. His hands were fidgeting, and he kept twisting his wedding ring around his finger. They exchanged small talk for a few minutes. Everything seemed normal, until their food arrived. That's when he took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and said something that made her entire body freeze. "I've been in love with you since the first day we met." My wife stared at him, completely shocked. "What?" she asked, thinking she had misheard. He exhaled shakily, his hands gripping the table. "I love you," he repeated. "I have for years, and I can't keep it in anymore." My wife felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "You're married to my sister," she hissed, lowering her voice so the people around them wouldn't hear. "I know," he said desperately, "but I can't help how I feel. I've tried to bury it, but every time I see you, I feel like I'm living a lie." My wife felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. This was a man she had always seen as a brother figure, a man she trusted completely. But he wasn't done. "If you were mine, I'd treat you like a queen," he continued. "I'd give you everything you deserve. You wouldn't have to pretend to be happy anymore." She blinked, stunned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "I know you're not happy with him. I can see it." Him. He meant me. My wife felt fear replace her shock. She immediately stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're insane," she whispered. "I don't ever want to hear this again." And then she walked out. Before my wife even made it back to her office, her phone started buzzing nonstop. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Please don't tell anyone. I don't want to lose my family. I had to tell you. I've kept this inside for so long." My wife's hands were shaking as she read the messages. She had known my brother-in-law for almost a decade, and not once had she suspected he felt this way. She had always been friendly, playful, kind, just like she was with everyone in the family. But now, she was terrified that she had somehow given him the wrong impression. With trembling fingers, she called me. The moment I picked up, I could hear the panic in her voice. "Babe, something really bad just happened." I immediately sat up. "What? What's wrong?" "It's your brother-in-law," she whispered. "He just told me he's in love with me." Silence. For a few seconds, I couldn't even react. What?" "He said he's loved me for years," my wife choked out. "He asked me to leave you for him." Rage. That was the only word I could use to describe what I felt at that moment. Blinding, uncontrollable rage. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Where are you right now? I'm on my way back to work. Go home, I said firmly. I'll meet you there. We need to talk about what we're going to do. At that moment, I knew exactly what had to happen next. My sister had to know. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, had just confessed his love for another woman. There was no way in hell I was keeping this a secret. But before I could even call her, my brother-in-law had already made his move. Because minutes later, my sister called me first. And the moment I answered, I knew something was terribly wrong. Hey, I said cautiously. But instead of a greeting, my sister's voice came through the phone, shaky and full of tears. I need to talk to you, she sobbed. What's wrong? I asked, my stomach twisting. And then she said the words that made my blood run cold. It's about your wife. She tried to seduce my husband. What the hell? My brother-in-law hadn't just confessed his feelings. He had flipped the story completely, and now he was accusing my wife of trying to have an affair with him. And just like that, this situation became so much worse. I always believed that as long as you told the truth, things would work out. I thought my sister, who had spent 8 years married to my brother-in-law, would immediately see through his lies once she knew what he had done. But I underestimated him. While my wife and I were still deciding how to handle the situation, he had already made his move. He didn't just deny everything, he flipped the story completely. He turned my wife, the victim, into the villain. And he convinced my sister that my wife was the one who had tried to seduce him. As I was still processing my wife's shocking revelation, my phone rang again. It was my sister. I frowned. I wasn't expecting her to call, and after what had just happened, I had a horrible feeling in my gut. Hey, I answered. But instead of a normal response, I heard her crying. I need to talk to you, she choked out. My stomach twisted. What's wrong? It's about your wife. My whole body went rigid. What about her? Then she said the words that made my blood run cold. She tried to seduce my husband. For a few seconds, I couldn't even speak. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. What the hell are you talking about? I finally demanded. He just told me, my sister sobbed. He said he's been trying to stay faithful, but your wife has been flirting with him for years. He said she tried to start an affair with him. I felt pure rage boil inside me. I knew what my wife had told me. I knew my brother-in-law was the one who confessed his feelings for her. And now he was spinning an entirely different story. He's lying, I snapped. He's lying to you, CS. But my sister sounded so lost, so unsure. I don't know who to believe, she whispered. He was crying. He swore to me that he would never do anything like this unless she pressured him into it. I felt sick. This man, the one we had trusted for years, was gaslighting my sister into believing that my wife was the one at fault. I took a deep breath, trying to control my rage. Listen to me, I said firmly. I'm coming over. We need to talk in person. You need to hear the real story. She hesitated. Okay. I hung up immediately and turned to my wife. She had been listening the whole time, and tears were already forming in her eyes. He's turning everyone against me, she whispered. He's trying to ruin my reputation. I pulled her into my arms. We won't let him. I grabbed my keys, and we drove straight to my sister's house. The moment we arrived, I could feel the tension hanging in the air like a storm. My sister was standing at the front door, her face pale and tear-streaked. And behind her, my brother-in-law stood with his head down, looking like a broken man. As soon as he saw me, he let out a deep sigh, like he was the victim here. I never wanted this, he mumbled. I ignored him completely. I turned to my sister. Do you really believe him? I demanded. She hesitated, glancing between us. I don't know, she admitted. I don't want to think that either of you would lie to me. I could see the pain in her eyes. She was stuck between her husband and her best friend, and this piece of garbage was manipulating that. Fine, I said, pulling out my phone. Let's see who's lying. I opened the messages my wife had received from him and handed my phone to my sister. Read those, I said, my voice shaking with fury, and then tell me who you believe. She took the phone hesitantly, and as she scrolled through the messages, her expression slowly changed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Please don't tell anyone. I don't want to lose my family. I had to tell you. I've kept this inside for so long. Her hands started trembling. Then she looked up at her husband, her eyes filled with anger and betrayal. You lied to me, she whispered. He went pale. I was scared, he stammered. I thought she wanted me too. I misread everything. Stop, she snapped. Her voice was ice cold. You tried to ruin her reputation just to cover your own ass, she hissed. You lied to me. You lied to my face. And you expected me to believe you? He tried to grab her hand, but she yanked it away. Get out, she said. His mouth fell open. Whoa, what? Get out, she repeated. I stepped forward, towering over him. You heard her, I said, my voice dangerously low. Get the hell out of this house before I make you leave. For a second, I thought he was going to fight it, but then he saw the absolute disgust in my sister's eyes, and he knew he had lost. With slumped shoulders, he turned around and walked out. As the door slammed shut behind him, my sister let out a shaky breath. Then she turned to my wife, and without a word, she pulled her into a tight hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have believed you. My wife started crying. I can't believe he did this, my wife sobbed. I trusted him. I thought of him as a brother. So did I, my sister whispered. She turned to me, her face set with determination. He's not getting away with this, she said. I'm going to find out everything he's been hiding from me. I nodded. Whatever you need, we're here. But none of us were prepared for what she was about to find. Because this wasn't just an affair waiting to happen. It was an obsession. And the moment my sister opened his laptop, everything changed. My brother-in-law was gone. My sister had thrown him out, and for the first time in hours, my wife and I could breathe again. But the relief didn't last long. Because my sister wasn't done. She needed to know the truth, the whole truth. And when she opened his laptop, we uncovered something far more disturbing than we ever imagined. After my brother-in-law left, my sister sat in silence for a long time. Then, finally, she looked up at me. I need to know if this was the first time, she said. I need to know if he's been lying to me about more than just this. She grabbed his laptop from the living room, flipped it open, and started searching. At first, there was nothing unusual, just normal files, emails, and photos from family events. But then, she found a hidden folder. And the moment she clicked on it, the color drained from her face. What is this? She whispered. My wife and I leaned in, and that's when we saw it. Hundreds of photos of my wife. But these weren't just normal pictures. These were secretly taken photos. Photos of her at family gatherings, laughing, talking, completely unaware that she was being watched. Photos of her playing with the kids, walking in the park, looking at her phone. And then there were the worst ones. Photos from our family vacation a few years ago. At the beach, my wife in a bikini. And every single one was just of her. Not a single group photo. No pictures of the rest of us. Just her. Taken from a distance. Some clearly zoomed in. Like someone had been watching her. Like someone had been obsessing over her for years. My wife covered her mouth in horror. Oh my God, she whispered. He's been doing this for years. I felt rage boil inside me. I had already hated him for what he did. But this? This was sick. As we scrolled through the folder, my sister shakily clicked on a video file. The moment it started playing, my wife let out a strangled gasp. It was a recording of her sleeping on our couch. From a family gathering. The camera was focused entirely on her face, and at one point, she shifted in her sleep, her shirt slipping slightly, and the camera zoomed in. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an inappropriate crush. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was an obsession. And my brother-in-law had been hiding it for years. My sister slammed the laptop shut, her hands shaking with fury. "He's disgusting," she whispered. He's been. She couldn't even finish her sentence. I turned to my wife, who was visibly trembling. "We need to go to the police," I said. She nodded silently, still in shock. But before we could even take another step, her phone buzzed. She looked down, and the second she saw the sender, she went completely pale. It was an email from my brother-in-law. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the email. And as she read it, her face twisted into pure horror. It was long, pages and pages of text. But at its core, it was a confession, a love letter, an obsession laid bare. He wrote about how he had been in love with her from the moment he met her, how he had been watching her, admiring her, fantasizing about her for years, how he believed they were meant to be together. But the most disturbing part? The last line. "If I can't have you, then no one can." Silence. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My wife was shaking. "He's threatening me," she whispered. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police. "My brother-in-law is stalking my wife," I told them, "and now he's threatening her." They took the situation very seriously. Within an hour, we were at the police station, handing over all the evidence. The emails, the videos, the secretly taken photos, the text messages, and finally, with all this in hand, the police issued a full restraining order. That night, my sister made her final decision. "I'm divorcing him," she said firmly, "and I'm making sure he never comes near me or my kids again." She filed for an emergency protection order for herself and her children. And as for my wife and me, we packed our bags and stayed at a friend's house for a few nights, just to be safe. But even with the police involved, I couldn't shake the fear. He was still out there. He had already crossed so many lines. Would he try something worse? Would he try to hurt my wife? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was terrifying. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. Even with the restraining order in place, even after filing reports with the police, I knew deep down that my brother-in-law wasn't finished. This wasn't just some fleeting infatuation. This was a full-blown obsession. And obsessed people? They don't let go easily. I was right to be afraid, because what happened next was far worse than anything I had imagined. A few nights after we went to the police, my wife and I were staying at a friend's house. We had decided not to sleep in our own home, just in case. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, like footsteps. Outside. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. At first, I thought I was just paranoid, but then I heard it again. Software slow, like someone was creeping around the house. I grabbed my phone, turned on the security cameras we had set up at home, and checked the live feed. My stomach dropped. Standing in our driveway, just outside the front door, was a man in a black hoodie. Watching. Waiting. I zoomed in, and my blood ran cold. It was him, my brother-in-law. He had found our house. He was standing there, staring at the door, doing nothing, just watching. I immediately called the police. "He's here," I whispered furiously into the phone. "My brother-in-law, the one we have a restraining order against. He's standing outside our house." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on the way, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The next morning, my wife woke up to a series of new messages. Blocked number. "Why won't you talk to me? I just wanted to see you. You don't have to be afraid. I would never hurt you. You belong to me." The last message made my wife's hands shake. "If I can't have you, then what's the point of anything?" A suicide threat. A desperate, manipulative last attempt to get her attention. At this point, I didn't care if he was genuinely suicidal or just trying to guilt-trip her. I was done. I forwarded everything to the police and my sister's lawyer. We need him locked up, I told them. With these new messages, we can escalate the case, the officer assured me. And for the first time, it felt like we were finally closing in on him. That same evening, I got a call from my sister. He showed up at my house, she said, her voice shaking. I felt pure rage flood through me. What? He was outside begging to see the kids, she whispered. I didn't let him in. I called the cops, but he ran before they got here. I couldn't take it anymore. I drove straight to her house, and as soon as I pulled up, I saw him, standing at the end of the street. Just watching. I got out of my car, fury surging through my veins. What the hell are you doing? I roared. He flinched but didn't move. I just wanted to see my family, he mumbled. You lost that right the moment you started stalking my wife, I yelled. He shook his head, eyes wild and desperate. She loves me, man, he said. She just doesn't know it yet. That was it. That was the moment I realized he was completely delusional. There was no reasoning with him, no talking sense into him. This wasn't about love. This was dangerous, twisted obsession, and I refused to let it continue. I took a step toward him. You come near my wife again, and I swear to God, Before I could finish, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The cops had arrived. This time, he couldn't run. He tried to talk his way out of it, saying he just wanted to see his kids. But with all the evidence we had gathered, his stalking, the threats, the texts, the videos, the cops weren't buying it. He was arrested on the spot, charged with stalking, harassment, and violating the restraining order. As they put him in the back of the police car, he locked eyes with me one last time, and what he said chilled me to my core. She'll never forget me. Then the car doors shut, and he was gone. My sister immediately moved forward with the divorce. She was granted full custody of their kids, and my brother-in-law? He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, not just for stalking and harassment, but because the investigation uncovered other victims, women he had stalked before my wife. This wasn't his first time. It was just the first time he got caught. Even though he was gone, my wife still struggled with the trauma, the fear of being watched, the nightmares, the anxiety. It took months for her to feel safe again. But she got through it. We both did. And eventually, life went back to normal. But we never forgot. Because sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones you should fear the most. My brother-in-law was finally gone. After months of stalking, manipulation, and obsession, he was behind bars. My sister had filed for full custody of their kids. My wife and I were trying to move on. And for the first time in a long time, we felt safe. But even though he was locked up, his presence still haunted us. And the scars he left behind weren't so easy to erase. For weeks after his arrest, my wife was still paranoid. She would wake up in the middle of the night, clutching my arm, whispering, "Did you hear that? Is someone outside?" I would have to reassure her, over and over again, that we were safe, that he couldn't hurt her anymore. But I couldn't blame her for being afraid, because I was still afraid too. Even though I knew he was locked up, I still checked the security cameras every night. I still kept a baseball bat by my bedside, because deep down, a small part of me kept thinking, what if he gets out? What if 18 months isn't enough? What if he comes back? Just when I thought we were finally putting the past behind us, he reached out again. One day, my wife received a letter from prison. She didn't open it. The moment she saw his handwriting, she turned pale and handed it to me. "I don't want to read it," she whispered. Just take it away." I sat down, took a deep breath, and carefully opened the letter. And what I read made my blood boil. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was delusional. In the letter, he wrote, "I know you hate me right now, but one day you'll understand. One day you'll realize that we were meant to be together. I don't blame you for what happened. I know you were scared. I know you let them control you. But when I get out, I'll be better. I'll prove to you that we belong together. And the last line? I'll wait for you. What? The hell? This man was completely detached from reality. He wasn't sorry. He hadn't learned his lesson. He was still convinced that my wife wanted him, and that one day they would be together. I didn't let my wife see the letter. Instead, I took it straight to the police and added it to our case file. Our lawyer contacted the prison, and with the restraining order still in place, we made sure he was banned from ever sending her another letter again. We also pushed to extend the restraining order beyond his sentence, a permanent one this time. And thankfully, the court approved it. Even after he got out, he wouldn't be able to come near us again. 18 months later, he was finally released. By that point, my sister and her kids had moved to another city. My wife and I had completely cut ties with his side of the family. And even though we knew he was free, he never contacted us again. We didn't know where he went. We didn't care. As long as he stayed far away from us, that's all that mattered. It took a long time for my wife to feel normal again. She started therapy to work through her anxiety. We moved to a new house. We changed our numbers. And eventually, the nightmares stopped. But even now, years later, we still live with the lesson he taught us. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers. They're the ones closest to you, the ones you trust the most. And if something ever feels off about someone in your life, don't ignore it, because you never know when that gut feeling might save you. This story isn't just about me, it's a warning. If someone is making you feel uncomfortable, trust your instincts. If someone is crossing boundaries, take action immediately. And most importantly, don't wait until it's too late. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever experienced something like this? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you enjoy true stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.